It had been a week since Boyd first heard the scream, and nothing had been the same. At least it seemed like a week. It was hard to tell, shut up as he was inside an empty apartment that creaked and popped with awful intent, like a stiff hand ready to make a fist and squash what remained. Time outside had stopped, while things moved within the walls, on the roof, under the floors, slithering veins and twitching tendons, scuttling feet. He had brought the scream home with him, and it drove out everything alive. All that was left shifted and shook, waiting to fall to the dust or launch into the sky that always loomed yellowish-grey and starless. In Los Angeles, the stars were below. Everything above was just a poorly lit backdrop. There were 2 of them here before the scream. 3, if you count the bunny. But even then the apartment was vacant, lost within a housing complex cowering in the rent-controlled backlot of dirty downtown. The apartment had more room now, and the fist wanted to close before the last of them slipped away, leave no one to whisper the tale. Boyd had to get out, had to get back to Century City. He needed to hear the scream one more time, because he finally knew what it meant. Just another hour. As soon as the sun would allow, he'd escape this tomb and make it in time to hear the last stanza before the stage went black. Boyd's aging Pontiac sputtered, hacking to life with an exhale of bluish smoke, sure to piss off his granola neighbors nuzzling their exotic morning blend. He looked up at the balcony of his 3rd-floor apartment, wondering if she'd be there to see him off, like stalwart wives lining the docks back in the good old days. All he found were dried vines clinging to the rusted railing. She never waved to him any more. Romantic notions died with the mystery. Boyd gave the 4-banger some gas. The Detroit engine block oscillated dangerously on its shoddy frame. It was just a matter of time before this bullshit car broke down, and then he'd be sentenced to the bus. Urine-soaked seats and squirming transients. The claustrophobic crush of musty bodies and sewer breath and windows that only cracked a few inches. Boyd put his head on the wheel, tasting last night's Jameson, and reached into his messenger bag. Forget quitting. Forget 2. It was going to be a 3-cigarette ride for sure. He lit up, sucked in, and held it in his lungs. It was the burn he would eventually miss. The car chugged away from the curb and onto the rain-slicked streets of Echo Park, greeted by a circle of vomit outside the local hipster haunt. The sort of bar that didn't have a sign because proper promotion was so passé. It never rained enough to clean the city. People just stepped over the mess and continued on, texting like they were writing the next great American novel, 140 characters at a time. Boyd rolled down his window, exchanging cigarette smoke for a dank carpet of exhaust. He moved through the traffic on autopilot, planning his caseload for the day while flipping back and forth from NPR and classic rock stations, looking for anything interesting. He found a mournful song on the forgotten end of the dial, occupied by pirate radio and Roland S. Howard. I'm soaring through outer space. There's no better place to be. The lyrics faded to a murmur as Boyd gazed mindlessly out his windshield. Eclectic boutiques, tattoo shops and taco stands, all fighting to define the neighborhood for whichever magazine was doing the write-up that month. Los Angeles always looked better through the lens of a camera. But it didn't really matter to Boyd. He didn't see any of it anymore. He'd gone blind from navigating the same route 5 days a week, and sometimes a 6th when college football wasn't in season. He was a rat, racing towards a mirage of overpriced cheese, hoping to make it to the branch office on the swankier side of town, where you could actually smell the ocean. He needed those negative ions and coastal gloom. Blue skies year-round could drive a transplant insane. No better place to be. Without warning, a flatbed truck overladen with shopping carts shot out of an alley and cut in front of Boyd. He heel-kicked his brakes, swerved and punched his car horn. It didn't work, and he was left bashing his steering column while the truck puttered away without reproval. No honk, no satisfaction. A rupee arm cartooned with cheap prison tats gave him the thumbs up from the driver's side. Boyd flipped off the disappearing tail-lights, cursing shitty ink and flatbeds everywhere. Definitely a four-smoke trip. Boyd turned off of Sunset on the east end of Hollywood, favouring less trafficked side streets as he continued west. The bustle of cars was just going to accordion the closer he came to the sea. Along a neighborhood block of stucco housing and barred windows near Santa Monica Boulevard, two tall, wiry transvestite prostitutes, real go-getters considering the hour, clattered over the gummy sidewalks, the night shift bleeding into the morning as they bled into their heels. Gaunt faces scanned every slowing car, looking for another trick. A last dip to carry them through the harsh sunlight into the dope-sick dusk, just to do it all over again. One of them whistled at Boyd. They made eye contact. Never lock eyes with anyone who calls the streets home. The tranny grabbed his crotch and yelled something lightly foul and mostly unintelligible. Boyd sped up, almost running over a shapeless woman bound to a wheelchair. She said nothing. Boyd turned up the radio and lowered his rearview mirror. Back into the teeth of the main drag and cresting Vermont Avenue, Boyd approached Mid-Wilshire, which was once a glittering area favoured by the golden age of Hollywood elite. Now it was just scarred wallpaper covered over by the capitalistic creep of Koreatown. Swatches of grand old Tudor homes broke up long expanses of unreadable neon atop barbecue joints, pool halls, and insurance companies. At every corner, young K-Towners in Gucci shades reclined low in their German cars, blasting house music and yammering into cell phones, while grandparents strolled the sidewalks, bewildered by this weird new world from under wide-brimmed visors. Lights changed, as did the scenery. Vermont turned to Pico, then Olympic. The landscape blossomed from grit to green, Indo-Asian to Hebrew and Arabic, until Boyd finally pierced the invisible radius of Century City, a carefully planned municipal workspace on the pampered backside of Beverly Hills. Century City's 4-block by 4-block stamp of white-collar purgatory was lined by rows of featureless, uninteresting skyscrapers filled with featureless, uninteresting people. The bland 9-to-5 little brother of far funkier downtown. Similar buildings sprouted up in regular patterns, enveloping the celebrity-heavy shopping mall at the heart of it all. In the latest round of the never-ending phallus-measuring contest between the 5 major movie studios, construction on a new edifice, one to dwarf all the rest, had commenced on Avenue of the Stars last year, but was abandoned when the economy went tits a few months back. Now a half-formed shell reached 900 feet into the air, like the bones of a long-dead dinosaur bleaching in the sun. A massive crane with its precariously outstretched arms stood guard on the east side, just in case the call came to finish. Sometimes it's just cheaper to walk away. The twin towers on Olympic marked the southwest border. Conquest of the Planet of the Apes was filmed here as Century City, hailed the City of the Future, was so advanced for its time back in the optimistic 1970s. Now it just looked bored, like a woman who cut her hair into a Q-tip and slid into oatmeal frumpiness for the rest of her life. Streets were kept clean, no riffraff, no flavour, no talking monkey handing out weapons to other talking monkeys. Lawyerville wouldn't have it any other way. The place overflowed during office hours, then became a ghost town after 6 p.m. Even the lone tavern closed by 9. Century City wasn't about aesthetics or nightlife. It was about making money, and it did so in large, obscene stacks. thanks to drones like Boyd, working for less educated but savvier superiors who had the balls to stake their claim. Nearing Constellation Avenue, Boyd's building came into view. 28 tastefully lit floors of steel and glass encased in a white lattice of cement. There were rollers in the foundation for when the big one hit. The big one was long overdue, the news promised. The locals couldn't care less. At the entrance driveway, a street repair crew stood around watching a man with wraparound shades and a handlebar moustache, leaning his belly into a whumping jackhammer, silently critiquing his technique. Boyd nodded at one of them, sharing that put-upon look of two worker bees struggling inside the hive. He flicked his card in front of the electric eye and burrowed down into the parking garage that already smelled of pan-seared garlic from the first-floor restaurant. The Pontiac pulled in behind Neil's car, a sunburst orange convertible Volkswagen Cabrio. The license plate read Nihilist and was surrounded by lefty stickers supporting a number of vague yet intensely earnest causes. Neil was the kind of guy who believed the moon landing wasn't just faked, it was a live stage show funded by the Illuminati. Neil believed a lot of crazy shit. Boyd hopped out of his car, dashed to the elevator, and stepped in just as the doors were closing. He seemed to arrive just a bit later each day. Inside, he punched the 12th floor button, rested against the mirrored wall, and faced front, like any right-thinking person would. The other occupant, a short man, was gearing up for conversation. He was one of those guys. Feeling the last shred of his personal space being invaded, Boyd looked over. The little man smiled. "Fuck a Monday, am I right?" the man announced, as if uttering a profundity on par with Plato. He was ridiculous, with slicked back hair and a shiny new suit, large green and white wingtips, polished to a wicked sheen. Like the Lollipop Guild sent out their best-dressed representative into the workforce. Who wore wingtips these days? "Yep, they're for the birds," Boyd muttered, concentrating on the ticking floor count. The man laughed far too loudly. Boyd regretted saying anything. Just then the lights dimmed and the car shuddered, halting their ascent. The silence was thick, in that peculiar way when two strangers stood too close. "Earthquake?" the man asked, his voice gaining an octave. "Brownout, maybe," Boyd offered. The elevator wasn't moving. The guts of the building went quiet. Boyd almost hoped the cramped box would plunge to the basement, instead of locking him up with this clown. The walls trembled, and the car began to climb again. "Fucking politicians," breathed the diminutive fellow, adjusting his cape of Napoleonic machismo. The elevator dinged. "Check you later, guy," the little man said, a wink and finger pistol pointed in his voice. Boyd was gone before the doors slid back together. At exactly 9:14, Boyd trudged the path least travelled by his boss, past file cabinets and chatty cubicles, to his office that was still cold from the weekend. 2 tall windows looked out at a carbon copy building next door. The limited view was his reward for dumping a decade of his waking life into the firm. He sat down at his desk, fired up his computer, and waited for the day to end. It was about 10 minutes till lunch when he heard the scream. One of the fluorescent lights was buzzing and blinking. Something must have been trapped, a moth most likely. The illumination it coveted so desperately would eventually kill it. Boyd leaned back to ponder the slow death on the ceiling when a scream came from outside. He thought nothing of it. The valets often communicated with a series of whoops and catcalls. Curious sounds weren't uncommon in this town. But it came again. A scream. A loud, strange scream. Boyd spun around in his chair and scanned the perimeter. Nothing but industrial brown, with a sliver of opaque blue above and a ribbon of charcoal below. Another scream penetrated the air. Boyd surveyed the building, but no one else was looking out. Windows didn't open in Century City. Suicide wasn't billable, and should be handled on your own time. The screaming continued. It seemed masculine at first, but grew to transcend gender. Such an odd sound, sometimes joyful, sometimes anxious. It had no terror in it, just an expression of something. Inscrutable, but surprisingly tantalizing. A scream wasn't supposed to sound like this. Boyd sat at his desk and listened. The screams came every 10 seconds for about 2 minutes, then ended abruptly. After several moments of silence, he stood in the doorway, looking up and down the hall at his passing co-workers. There wasn't a mention of screaming in the snatches of conversation, usually devoted to obscure films playing at the Noir, or the latest article in Slade. Uppity bunch, or at least pretending to be, though it made sense that the rest of the office didn't hear what Boyd did. Most didn't have windows with a spectacular view of nothing. Still, those on the same side of the suite would have heard it too. "Holding up the wall, Stansfield?" Boyd flinched. His boss, Mr. McIntosh, squinted at a quivering sheaf of papers he always held in front of him like a corporate shield. McIntosh never looked anyone square in the eye. "No, sir," Boyd fumbled. "Hey, did you hear?" McIntosh shoved a portion of the invoices at Boyd. "Make these calls. It's the end of the month and 8 of your clients haven't paid." Boyd took the bills, as McIntosh shuffled down the hallway, his face buried in statements, like a vulture fussing over a carcass. "You gotta stay on, people, Stansfield," he added over his stooped shoulders. "That's the only way to reach the top." "Capitalism is for killers," issued a voice from the next office. Boyd ducked inside, where Neil nested amid a cluttered womb of files. The walls were plastered with bits of French philosophy, maps of forgotten French cities, and various ironic and rarely funny internet memes. France and irony were very important to Neil. With his earbuds firmly in place, Neil intermittently banged away at his keyboard while spooning brie onto those fancy crackers from Trader Joe's. He somehow kept everything straight in this junkyard of paperwork and vegetarian snacking. The slovenly order of chaos. "I wonder how many bodies McIntosh has stashed in his bank account," Neil said, grinning through a mouthful of soft cheese. "They died for our sins," Boyd said with a smirk. He enjoyed their wry banter, but couldn't imagine having a beer with the guy. It just seemed too much goddamn work. "At least somebody did," Neil quipped. "Jesus had better things to do." Boyd chuckled, then remembered why he came in. "Oh, hey, did you hear that this morning?" "Hear what?" Neil said, rummaging through a folder. "The screaming." Neil shrugged, pointing to his ear. "All I heard this morning was Claude Francois and lectures from McIntosh." The uppity bunch had found their king. Boyd walked to the window. Neil only had one. It was coming from somewhere outside. Boyd looked out at the intersecting geometry of building, roof, wall, and sky. "There aren't any hospitals round here, are there?" "Hospitals?" "Yeah, you know, like mental hospitals." Of course not. The insane were secreted away inland, amongst the dust and hills of the other California you never see on Entertainment Tonight. And no one lives in Century City. Not even the homeless. They all lived in Boyd's neighborhood, he thought. By now, Neil wasn't listening. This was obviously more interesting to Boyd. "Seems weird to me," Boyd said quietly. "It's a weird city, man," Neil mumbled, his flight from the conversation punctuated by a foul belch. "You hear about the sinkhole?" "Hmm?" Boyd wasn't listening either, internally mapping out the suspect points on Century City's coordinate plane. "Took out a whole block of warehouses in Commerce last night. Apparently the ground just imploded." Neil's chubby fingers danced over his keyboard like a concert pianist. "The mayor took a break from banging news ladies to show up and declare it a cause for concern," he air-quoted, shaking his head. "Corporate simp. I mean, can you believe—" Neil looked up, realizing he was alone. "Asshole!" Boyd walked into the file room to grab a cup of coffee before heading off for his lunchtime smoke. He never ate lunch, didn't have the stomach for it. Margaret, the doughy office lifer collecting chins instead of wedding anniversaries, stood humming by the copy machine. She unconsciously counted along with the sheets of blue G28 forms spitting out of the sharp X3 400. "Hiya, Boyd," she chirped without even turning. 25 years of surviving company politics gave one extraordinary peripheral vision. "Hey, Margaret, how goes it?" Boyd said. He found himself putting on a chipper attitude when he talked to her. He had a gift for adapting to the postures of those around him. Professional blending, his girlfriend called it, trying to hide the irritated roll of her eyes. But it seemed to serve Boyd well, as his reputation for affability would attest. Boyd's girlfriend thought it left him indistinct, like a reflection in a bowl of milk, and about as deep. "Oh, you know," Margaret said. She always answered the same way, as if on the verge of launching into a string of uninteresting complaints that thankfully never came. "Yeah," Boyd said, reaching for the door. He always answered the same way, too. "Crazy screams, huh?" Margaret said absently. Boyd stopped. "You heard it?" "It sounded like a little girl." No, it didn't, Boyd thought. It sounded anything but a little girl. "I called the police," Margaret continued, lining up the edges of paper on top of the copier. "They said they'd search the area. They're always so nice." "Yeah, that's probably a good idea," Boyd said, still baffled by her description. He saw this woman more than his own mother, more than anyone in his life outside the office, but didn't know one thing about her, other than her penchant for mauve nurses' shoes and bedazzled QVC blouses. He opened the back door to the suite. "Spooky, right?" Margaret said as Boyd walked out into the hallway. "Poor little thing," she added, returning to her hum. The door shut slowly behind him. Outside, Boyd gathered with the other smokers, standing the legislated 20 feet from the entrance, as not to offend anyone's already smog-tainted innards. He took a drag of his cigarette and looked up at the buildings rising like colossal rectangular pillars. He checked the streets. Nothing out of the ordinary. No one who looked capable of emitting such a queer sound with such dedicated regularity. So, where were they coming from? Boyd's contemplations were interrupted by the appearance of his boss inside the building's glass lobby. He was returning from a lunch meeting, looking smaller and more fragile under the glare of the sun. Mackintosh shook hands with an equally aged gentleman sporting a shock of silver-rinsed hair, costumed in what looked like a natty yacht captain's jacket and ascot, sans hat. They guffawed about an inappropriate anecdote, told over well-done sirloin. The moneyed old owned the world, flapping their stingy wattles at the doe-eyed plebs. Neil might have said that once. Boyd turned, hiding his cigarette. He had been working at the firm for over 10 years, but still felt like a shamed child if the boss saw him smoking, even on his lunch break. He didn't know if it was a moral worry, or that Mr. Mackintosh would think he was chain-smoking on company time. Either way, it was something to be hidden. Boyd returned to his apartment just as his girlfriend was getting ready to go out for the evening, wearing the kind of outfit he forgot she owned. "Girls' night!" she squealed. Sometimes she didn't come home from girls' night until early the next morning, citing breakfast at IHOP as an unimpeachable explanation. She was probably seeing someone else, or a series of someone else's, but Boyd didn't really care. This was the natural progression of things. Once one of these someone else's impressed her enough, she'd leave him, and that would be it for this sophomoric experiment in playing house. Some people didn't belong together. Some people didn't belong with anyone. Boyd poured himself a drink and let out the bunny, which dashed under the table to ignore him for the night. The TV was blaring some insipid Bravo reality show. Boyd clicked it off and sat in front of the window. It wasn't as big as the ones in his office, but at least it opened. He battled the weathered side jambs and pushed it halfway up, letting in the sounds and smells of Echo Park, which was just starting to fill up with Trustafarians and commuting wannabes. Boyd quaffed his drink and lit a cigarette, not bothering to blow the smoke out of the window like he normally did. As the chilled poison chewed through his stomach lining, he watched the outside world behind a haze of swirling white, hoping that someone would scream. All week Boyd heard it. The more he listened, the more he understood, detecting layers, nuances. It seemed to have a music to it, a melody folded inside dissonance, like a structured baroque refrain woven inside jazz. His work suffered. Mr. Mackintosh noticed, shoving even more papers at him accompanied by loud rebukes. Mackintosh was a master of making an example of layabouts. Boyd's co-workers noticed too, occasionally peeking into his office with concern, but he didn't see them. He was turned to the window, waiting for the next one. Wednesday came, but the screamer didn't, and Boyd was forced to focus on his work. 2 people didn't show up that day, complaining of a migraine and intestinal troubles, respectively. Mackintosh grumbled an oath about brown bottle flu, levelling a knowing glare at Boyd. Normally he would have blushed, having fallen victim to the similarly virulent green bottle flu more often than was prudent. But today Boyd barely registered the judgmental sniff. He was distracted. Something was missing. It was 10 minutes to lunchtime, and Boyd stopped pacing long enough to grab his smokes and exit the office, which was starting to feel like a quotidian morgue. Stiff bodies stuffed into small boxes. He walked right past Mackintosh, who was delegating case files while chastising Sandy, the childlike receptionist just out of junior college. She hunched sadly at her desk, crowded with stuffed animals, felt flowers, and pictures of unfortunate-looking children. "Hi, Boyd!" she squeaked. He grinned tightly, avoiding eye contact as he slipped into the file room. Margaret was standing post at the copier, a flurry of pink I-907 forms gathered at her feet. Boyd paused. Margaret? Margaret stared at the wall, a profoundly blank look in her eyes. She seemed far away, her lips slightly pursed, rounded into a soft O. Reams of paper piled up in the copier collating bin, bending, crumpling, slumping to the floor. "Heya, Margaret," Boyd said gently. She didn't look up. "Margaret," he repeated. Her head turned slowly, gazing at Boyd without recognition. Then her eyelids fluttered, and the practiced smile slowly etched across her face, bringing her back to life like a rewound toy. "Hiya, Boyd," she said dreamily. Boyd pressed the clear button on the copier, picked up the collection of forms, arranged them as best he could, and handed them to Margaret. "I think that's enough," he said. "Yeah," she replied. "I suppose it is." She walked away, pink paper falling from her limp, flabby arms. Boyd lit a cigarette, fidgeting nervously. He couldn't sit still, even outside. The screams came from out here. But they hadn't today. His neck felt tense, his muscles restless. The air was loud and the sky garishly bright. Every conversation was a vulgar shout, mixing together in a cacophony of flattened noise. He stood unlawfully close to the door, and blew out a fast hiss of smoke, enduring glares from the PC Nazis for his effort. A woman walking by suddenly stopped to Boyd's right. He saw her out of the corner of his ever-sharpening eye, and figured she was glowering at him like the others. He turned to his would-be accuser, expecting jackboots guised in a scowl. But she wasn't looking at him. She was looking up, entranced by something Boyd couldn't see. With a sublime calm she sucked in her breath and closed her eyes, her feet lifting at the heels. Then she rose, passing over the sun like a human eclipse. It blinded him. He blinked, then found her again. She was walking away. "Sneaking off for a cigarette, Stansfield?" Mackintosh had noted his burning grit. Boyd hid it between his fingers, the smoke wafting up in the static air. He waited for the panic of discovery. But it didn't come. "Yep," Boyd said casually, taking another drag and squinting off into the distance like the Marlborough Man. "You know," Mackintosh said, his voice oddly conversational, "I used to smoke too." The old man was actually smiling, a devilish sort of expression on his normally stoic face. "Picked it up in Korea, along with as many village girls as I could get my hands on," he chuckled. "I gave up both when I came back to the States." He looked at Boyd conspiratorially. "Our little secret." The elevator opened and Boyd walked back up the hall, passing Mr. Resnick, the family law attorney from the opposite side of the floor. He was a kindly man, pear-shaped and endearingly dorky, wore a fanny pack and a baseball hat with his rumpled suit, always carried a thermos filled with some sort of benign soup. "The Dodgers really flubbed the ninth, didn't they?" Mr. Resnick said rhetorically. The Dodgers were the connective small talk, even though Boyd hadn't watched an MLB inning since collecting Topps baseball cards as a kid. Ron Say and Davy Lopez and their substantial moustaches were the last Dodger references Boyd knew anything about. "Couldn't believe it," he exclaimed with faux outrage, imagining his dopey mug staring back at him in a bowl of milk. Mr. Resnick patted Boyd on the arm. "We'll get 'em again before the playoffs." "Sure will," Boyd said. "Next time we bring out the big bats." Resnick smiled and moved on, in that labored waddle of the chubby kid walking alone on the playground. On the way home, Boyd deviated from his ingrained course, driving down filthy alleys and seedy backstreets, hoping to get lost. But he knew the city too well. At one point, on a burned-out avenue in Linwood, he pulled over and wept like he did the day they pulled him from 7th grade track practice and told him about the accident. No one noticed. Boyd tried multiple keys to unlock his front door, but none seemed to work. His first instinct was that he was drunk. But he wasn't. Not yet. His second was that the locks were changed while he was gone. It felt like a long time since the morning when he stumbled down the staircase, heading for his dusty car. Finally, the right key shimmied in, and the door swung open. His girlfriend was on the phone in their bedroom, talking in low, giggling tones. Her bedroom, actually. Boyd slept on the couch, in front of the computer, or on the floor, depending on where he blanketed his brain. He felt like a stranger in his own home, creeping quietly to fetch his outdated office togs after his shower. He didn't want to wake her. It only got nasty when he did. Stranger in a strange land, land of ice and snow. The radio never played Iron Maiden. Boyd hadn't turned his on in days. Cracking the door, he snuck his head in to let her know that he was home. She ignored him, laughing at what was obviously the most hilarious joke ever told on the other end of a phone line. Boyd closed the door. Out in the living room, Boyd eyed the bunny sprawled out in its cage. It appeared to look back, but Boyd knew better. The bunny hated him, looking for a vulnerability, an exposed soft spot. It would lunge at his vitals if he ever laid too close. It never made a sound, never screamed. It just squatted in its own filth and watched him, weighing its chances. Boyd got up and walked to the cage. An endless labyrinth of interconnected skyscrapers replicated tortured fractals. They rose to fantastic heights and melded into a murky darkness that cast shadows blacker than the hue ever dreamed. Massive shapes undulated in the mist overhead. His shoes squished against the pliant obsidian stone, cutting through the frantic barks and cackles echoing within the twisting maze. Cyclopean buildings broke free from one another, sagging to the ground like branches of miles-high weeping willows. They wanted to snatch him up and take him away. They wanted to rend him limb from limb. Boyd tried to run, but dimensional space was melting away, replaced by a furious chaos, a void without direction or meaning. This infinite nothingness was more hideous than anything that came before it. Boyd was starting to lose himself in the fear and entropy. Just then an unnerving scream punctured the maelstrom, injecting fullness into the inky vacuum. Gravity returned. Boyd writhed, inching forward like a mealworm. He opened his mouth and extended his tongue, trying to touch it, taste it, bring it down deep where it belonged. The scream. Boyd screamed. Their voices fused as the churning abyss roared all around them. Boyd sat up with a jerk, his voice dry and sore, as if he'd been screaming all night. He didn't know where he was until he saw the empty rabbit cage. He closed his eyes, trying to recapture the exact state of sleep from seconds ago. He heard a scream, but it was that of a woman. It had no music in it, only horror. Thursday arrived, and so did the screamer. Perhaps Boyd brought it back through his dream. He excitedly closed his door, taking in every note, every nuance. He was studying. Boyd wasn't sure how long he was enthralled when he noticed that someone had opened his door. Poking his head out into the hall in search of a culprit, he didn't see the man fall past his window, a snap shadow of violent descent. The scream came again, and Boyd set his jaw. Find the screamer. Sidestepping new temps had become a full-time job. Hired to replace the 6 veteran employees who had recently quit, they flitted to and fro, eyes sparkling with the enthusiasm of new walls and unformed impressions. Mackintosh was in his office with his door closed. He never closed his door unless he was arguing with his wife. His wife died 3 years ago. Boyd sped toward Sandy's desk, where the phone rang incessantly, all the lines lit up, all unanswered. She paid it no mind, glued to her computer screen with sunken eyes, tapping her mouse so quickly it sounded like chattering teeth. The phone continued to ring, irritating Boyd enough to pause in his quest. Is anyone hearing these phones? She said nothing, scratching a bleeding groove into her arm as she clicked through hundreds of images of death, dismemberment and mutilation on several websites at once. Sandy's desk had since been cleared of its usual cheery accoutrements. Her eyes darted over the gruesome pictures as she clicked and scratched. "Sandy?" Boyd said. "No," she replied, drawing out the word into a carnal groan, consumed by her obsessive mental upload of atrocity. Boyd suddenly missed tacky felt flowers and pictures of children he didn't know. Just then, screams filtered in from the lower levels. They weren't the screams Boyd cared about, because everyone in the suite heard them too. He pushed through the stunned horde, assembling outside. A semicircle had formed round a spectacle. Cell phones sprang up to capture the moment for posterity, dispersing the tragedy into the networked ether. A pulpy mound of gore and blown-out fabric lay in front of him. This was the body of a man, splattered onto the scrubbed marble fronting the building. The impact of the fall had pulverized his body and exploded it through his suit. Large hunks of bone and flesh and brain diffused into a wild but vaguely human shape, like smashed tubes of crimson oil paints arranged into a crude chalk outline. Rivulets of blood ran unimpeded across the smooth stone, leaking toward feet that scurried back from the creep of warm fluids. A bright red stream collected around an ejected shoe. It was a white and green wingtip, its immaculate shine reflecting a glint of sun. Boyd looked at the lump of tissue and skin. His eyes opened wide, remembering the last thing the exuberant little man said to him. He smiled. "Check you later, guy," Boyd said aloud, his voice ringing out amongst the hushed din. A collective gasp, then frowns of disgust. Everyone backed away as he started laughing. The cell phones turned on him. A beefy man in gym wear shook his head ominously. He laughed harder, rattling his organs before approaching sirens drowned him out. Boyd's explosive laughter seized up his pharynx and he started to choke. He fell to all fours, spitting phlegm onto the tile, frosting the sanguine ponds that were beginning to coagulate like day-old pudding. Boyd rolled over. The broken window 18 floors up gaped like a missing tooth in a Titan's skull. A few floors below, Boyd could barely make out Mr. McIntosh looking at the scene from his corner office. Security emerged, moving everyone back into the building, entreating the crowd to go home. But Boyd didn't want to leave, even though Century City was now a deafening mess of gossip and bullhorns. A beefy shadow towered over him, and a foot came down hard on his face. This guy wasn't wearing wingtips. In the car, Boyd held an ice pack to his fractured cheekbone. Only an hour before, he had regained consciousness as the trauma crew scraped the body off the ground, scooping remains into thick plastic bags. The area was free of civilians, save for a few haunted co-workers being questioned by police. Boyd got to stay till the end. The EMT suggested a ride to the hospital, but he refused, insisting he was fine and had to get home to let out his incontinent Labrador. Boyd didn't have a Labrador, and he certainly wasn't fine. Worse, he had missed the screamer, and now had to wait one more day. A speeding police car whizzed by, nearly clipping Boyd's side mirror, its light flashing and sirens yelping. Feeling woozy, he opened his window to get some air. The raw howl of ambulance and fire truck came from a dozen different directions, but only a few headed toward Century City. There were other acts of disorder occurring nearby. Maybe a wildfire in the hills. Maybe a riot. Something was heating up in the city. Suddenly, a honk startled him. To his left, Mr. Resnick waved from behind the wheel of a sensible tan Volvo, smiling like he was on a pleasant Sunday drive through Amish country. Boyd waved back. They were too far apart to talk about the Dodgers. He looked ahead, still sensing Resnick's ghastly grin aimed at the side of his face. He tapped the wheel impatiently, desperate to move forward, to flee this awkward standoff. Finally the light changed, but Resnick's smile didn't, as he peeled out, raced up the street, and disappeared around a curve. Boyd clicked on the radio, trying to fog over his hyper-alert brain with the clang of instruments. But all the music stations were overtaken by emergency broadcasts, reporting scattered acts of violence and gathering mobs. A bombing at the Mondrian Hotel. Mass stabbing on 3rd Street Promenade. Heavily armed man holding hostages at a Brentwood school. Burning buildings in the Beverly Hills shopping district just off Doheny. He slammed on his brakes, narrowly avoiding rear-ending a line of stopped cars at the green light ahead. He squeezed the steering wheel, steadying himself as traffic lurched forward. Boyd followed suit, joining the slow-moving parade of rubberneckers as they passed an accident. A tan Volvo had ploughed into a cafe on Pico. Broken bodies were laid out on the sidewalk. The injured lined the curb, heads in bloody hands. As Boyd crept by, he saw a man lying under an insulated blanket, receiving oxygen and medical treatment. It was Resnick. His body convulsed as if hooked up to an electroshock machine. He was still smiling. The apartment was cleared of most of his furniture, including his girlfriend. She likely fled to a different, now familiar home with all of her belongings, and the body of a dead rabbit sealed in a freezer bag. Boyd took in the vacancy around him. 3 rapid gunshots came from outside. He sat in the middle of the floor, unable to feel the grooved hardwood beneath. He was expanding, hovering in between worlds. His skin tightened, ready to burst through a throbbing eye socket, spraying fizzy goo onto the peeling wall. Something in the foundation moved, like ancient lava coming to the surface. eating sinkholes into decaying urban blocks. The four corners moaned as the building vibrated ever so slightly. It was trying to get up while it still could. The giant movie screen, refracting all the light and noise down to the near-sighted city that created it. Something detonated a few miles away. Boyd wanted to run to his car, drive back to his 2 cold windows, but he had no key. So he'd wait, as he had been waiting all his life. If he could only get through this night in one solid piece, he'd find out everything tomorrow. The ticking seconds of hermetic time were suffocating. With his good eye he stared down the horizon until it sweat and broke, grudgingly giving up the first rays of dawn with a defeated shrug. Boyd was on his way before the sun could wax hesitantly from behind the bluffs ringing Hollywood. He'd survived the night, and now the day was his. He'd find the screamer, and demand an explanation. The streets were devoid of the usual bustle at this hour. A dark silhouette loped from an alley. Flailing arms seized something heavy from the sidewalk and pulled it back into the shadows. At the next light, Boyd spied someone waltzing round with what looked like a floppy, life-size rag doll, twirling it round and round like an enraptured dervish. Morning slid from grey to pink, framing plumes of smoke lazing up into the sky like slowly unspooling phantasms. The radio blared a song that Boyd once knew but no longer recognized. I'm standing next to a mountain, chop it down with the edge of my hat. These chords, the end of the world, the lyrics, a eulogy. Pick up all the pieces, make an island, might even raise a little sand. Skinny palm trees on fire, swayed like dancing birthday candles. Boyd's autopilot had disappeared, replaced by an innate magnetic pull to a destination lying due west, flagged by the framework of a hulking crane. He felt his eyes closing, but still saw everything that lay ahead of him in stark relief. As he neared Century City, abandoned cars littered the streets, strewn about like Hot Wheels around shuttered shop fronts. The scream had escaped, taking in the surrounding neighborhoods, turning all life into specters. The second story of a nondescript synagogue spewed ash, as flames licked out from blackened holes. No one attempted to douse them. Ghosts didn't like water. They liked synagogues even less. From Pico onto Century Park East, Boyd dodged debris, discarded clothing, a gutted snack cart. A long, broad streak of scarlet stained the pavement, as if someone hit a deer and dragged it under their drivetrain, until it finally ground down to nothing. Up ahead, a wall of demolished trucks stacked 30 feet high, 2 blocks in front of his building. Boyd killed his brakes and got out of the car. He looked at this bulwark of crushed steel not as a shock, but a challenge. The sound of a muffled jackhammer zigzagged off the skyscraper canyons. He began to climb. His arms and legs torn, Boyd jumped from the barricade and jogged toward the front entrance. A disheveled woman roamed aimlessly, naked from the waist down, her tank top covered in blood, a clump of white hair in each hand. She passed a man slamming his head against a dumpster, trying to scream. Nothing but a dry wheeze came out. Boyd doddered into the driveway, approaching the street crew, somehow still hard at work. They were splattered with what looked like tar, jackhammering something spongy into the asphalt, something giving and wet. Vicious chunks of matter splashed up onto their tattered overalls. Boyd didn't meet their eyes, didn't care to be amongst them any more. His business was elsewhere. The lobby was devoid of security, and the elevators were out. Boyd kicked open the emergency exit doors and took on the stairs, bounding up 3 at a time. He had to get higher, to his 2 cold windows. He had to be in position when it came. He entered the suite through the back, past quiet cubicles and barren offices. Nothing seemed out of place. Everyone was just gone, even Margaret. Her absence, and the silence of her favourite copier, made the depopulated workplace all the more desolate. At the end of the hall, Mr. Mackintosh's door was closed. Boyd went for the handle. Amongst the bad art and impressive diplomas adorning the walls, Mackintosh hung in the centre of the room, his head nearly severed at the shoulders by a garrote of wires reaching down from a tear in the ceiling. His fingers, gripped like talons, had come to an unholy rest, clawing the air for paper. Boyd felt dizzy and staggered to the couch. He hadn't slept in days. The world was closing in on him. The buildings were bending again. He wasn't sure if he heard it at first. The mind sometimes doesn't want to give up the intoxicating apprehension and accept the moment. But it was happening. The eerie wail reverberated through the panes of glass, immense in its inexplicability. It cocooned him, soothing his spirit while igniting his thoughts. From the converging wall of windows ending in a sharp isosceles point, Boyd could finally see where it was coming from. This was the catbird seat, taking in the full measure of the scream. He could feel it, drawing him in, daring him to fly. He knew that he could. The thud of Mackintosh's body hitting the desk snapped Boyd out of it. He moved back from the windows, away from the hungry triangle, and stumbled over the decapitated corpse of his boss draped over a high-backed chair. The head had rolled to a stop in a corner, regarding Boyd with mushy eyes and a swollen, jutting tongue. Mackintosh must have known all along, and kept it inside. God damn him. The scream came again. From somewhere in the office, a hint of elegant typing gave him pause. Neil sat completely naked at his computer, his ears free of their pretentious music. Surrounding him was a bunker of inked-up parchment stacked like sandbags, serving as protection from the outside world. Blood caked his truck tire belly, smeared down to his knobbly genitals and matted pubic hair. The thick ankle of a middle-aged woman stuck out from behind a cabinet, away from its usual post at the copy machine. Neil looked up, his eyes fevered with insanity. "I heard it, Boyd! I heard it!" Boyd yanked a fax machine from the wall. "They died for our sins," Neil said. Boyd raised the machine high over his head. "They died for our sins!" Neil's sweaty face caved into the back of his cranium, as fragments of plastic and brain decorated French philosophy. Ignoring pockets of slaughter and destruction, Boyd sprinted to the cusp of Century City, where his magnetic pole awaited. Nothing barred his way. Everything within earshot was wrapped up in their own private hell. Boyd barely touched the grated stairs as he climbed upward, ever upward, in his ascent to salvation. Though he wasn't safe inside this beast, it had no skin and couldn't hide him, which made it the perfect place for the screamer to be. No one ever looks at the bones when there's so much else in full rot. At last, Boyd stood at the top of the unborn building. He could see the ocean, the mountains. He could see where he'd never live again. The whole world was ablaze. And it was beautiful. Just then something moved, a figure huddled on the end of the crane's gargantuan arm. The screamer. Boyd scrambled toward it. He needed to get close, needed it to scream again. The shape stirred. It was a child, a little girl, pale in complexion and eye, as if all her colour had been drained. She looked at Boyd, then through him, her lips beginning to part. He couldn't believe it. This was the scream? Without making a sound, the girl rocked back onto her heels and dropped from the crane. Another small thing, falling like hail from the blue skies, born to paint the world below. Boyd ran to the edge and watched her flutter gently downward, as if she weighed nothing. A husk of skin, stretched as a human, but empty inside. She caught an updraft and began to twirl like a helicoptering maple seed, drifting off into the smouldering horizon. Boyd never knew if she touched the ground. He fell to his knees in agony. He never got to hear the last scream, never got to know what it wanted. Just then, another scream split the air. He leapt to his feet and searched frantically. It was close. It had to be right here. Where was it? The scream erupted again just yards away, knocking him flat with a blast of concussive modulation. His ears ringing, he peered around the platform, discovering a minute dent in the thick concrete spine that held up the ribs of the building. On closer inspection, he found that the divot was really a small hole bored into the superstructure, corkscrewing down into the stone and steel. Something tiny scurried out of the aperture and stopped at the lip of the opening. Boyd squinted and leaned in, making out the details of a delicate arthropod creature a centimetre long. At first glance, it resembled a hatchling praying mantis, influenced by the lingering genes of the cuttlefish. Its body was firm, yet malleable and totally translucent. Indescribable colours whirled and pulsed inside, and the sense of a boundless intelligence radiated outward. It was exquisite, yet horribly alien in its erratic gestures. More unsettling was the play of the rising light, which seemed to arc around the organism, displacing the air, as if our reality recoiled from it in revulsion. It didn't belong here. It was antithetical to everything in our existence. Boyd had never been so terrified in his life. Not of death, but of a destination more inconceivable, from which this exiguous being had sprung. The sheer idea of what was before him threatened to heave Boyd into unconquerable lunacy. His skin crawled with the sensation of a million needling legs. Bile clogged his throat, and his heart hammered his chest, yet he still sensed himself moving closer to the minuscule thing, compelled by a primal yearning that he couldn't understand. Boyd reached out a hand. When his quavering finger nearly touched the creature, it froze, hunkered down and released a sonic discharge, which in this place was understood in terms of longitudinal waves, translated into a booming, sonorous scream. This was the screamer. This was what screamed. Boyd's mortal shell disintegrated. His consciousness catapulted through space, moving inside an immeasurable helix of compressed notes, a cosmic symphony where light had not yet reached. A resonance that bred madness when poured into a single shriek, created beyond the rim of comprehension. He wanted to shut it off, but it was too late. The information came in painful tides, born in the elemental swirl of the unquiet void, sent across the gulf of space and time. Do the bidding, and spread the chaos. It screamed, as Boyd grovelled in supplication to something no larger than a silverfish, which possessed the knowledge of 1 billion spent galaxies and paths to dimensions unimaginable. His ears burst, and red tears dripped onto the platform as it screamed again and again. He'd never hear anything else. Boyd felt something crack inside him, below him, as his brain filled to the saturated brink, intertwining with the sentience of the tiny entity. The screamer was a pawn, utterly alone in a place so incongruous and insanely aligned. So it screamed, as would a confused and frightened child banished from home. Its very presence here didn't fit, and that which sent it knew this. It would tear through the carefully stitched order of this insignificant rock. This tiny thing, unaware of its own power, was pulling our world apart. Boyd wanted to die, praying for a heaven or even a hell instead of the roiling continuum that waited just beyond this sphere. Nothing was sacred. Science became myth. Only death would preserve ignorance before the canopy was torn down. He wanted to die to turn it all off. As the city below was being eaten alive, Boyd thought of insipid reality shows, hoping he'd still be heavy enough to hit the ground. The screamer took flight, spiraling into the air with impossible speed, following the lean of the rising sun. It would land elsewhere soon and scream again, as it screamed here. That which brought it over was gone. Some locks never shut twice. Boyd could no longer move his limbs. His body wasn't his anymore, just a jumble of meaningless nostalgia. His changeling eyes were aimed into the starless sky that should have been blue, but was now a dome of ash, gathering below the nighted eternal. The firmament over Los Angeles had never looked this way, and would never look this way again. But Boyd didn't see it. His vision focused on places further away. He only saw 2 windows. Behind neither were heaven or hell. The earth cracked and opened beneath the crane and the towering skeleton. The brittle bones split like matchsticks, caving in on themselves, taking everything with them. The fissure spread like a gaping maw. The city of the future pitched and collapsed, shattering into the stardust that built it up and tore it down countless times before, rejoining all the forgotten things in the profound silence below, as everything above it screamed.